go home now.
Call on budget-related matters. I call the member for Baulkham Hills.
Thank you, Madam Assistant Speaker. I rise to speak on behalf of the people of Baulkham Hills in reply to this wonderful budget handed down by the Baird government. This budget is welcomed by all Western Sydney MPs, particularly the government MPs, and I know I speak for so many of my colleagues who have really identified this budget as the freedom budget. And I'll come back to that. It's the freedom budget because this budget confirms the freedom of liberalism, the freedom of economic reform, the freedom that is only associated when we have Liberal members on the Treasury benches. I heard some of the fallacies and fairy tales offered by members from the opposition in their replies. And, Madam Speaker, in my 45 years in this country, 45 years on this earth indeed, I've spent 30 of them as members of the Liberal Party. As a member of the Liberal Party, having joined Bankstown Young Liberals on my 16th birthday, one thing that motivated me, Madam Acting Speaker, to join the Young Liberals in Bankstown, not an area notoriously known for liberalism, although I do note that we have Liberal members from the Bankstown LGA both at a federal and state level these days, so they've obviously wised up a little bit since I left. But, Madam Speaker, I remember in my time as a young Liberal in Bankstown the reckless and disgraceful economic management of Labor governments both here and in Canberra. And I think it's important that when we're talking about the 2015-16 Baird, Berejiklian and Grant budget, we set the parameters around exactly what a good budget is. We highlight and compare and contrast what Labor does in government. Mr Acting Speaker, one thing that motivated me to join the Liberal Party all those years ago was my local member in Bankstown was a bloke named Paul Keating. He really galvanised my views on liberalism because Paul Keating was nothing short of an economic wrecking ball. Members of this House who are old enough would recall the recession that we had to have. That was a catch cry for Mr Keating because he thought that he could get away with his poor economic management by way of press release and slick spin. But what Mr Keating did as Treasurer was forced 1 million people on the unemployment heap. 1 million people without livelihoods. That was an unemployment rate averaged right across the nation of over 10%. Can you imagine the Baird government waking up and having to explain to the people of New South Wales that overnight the unemployment rate in this state had gone to 10%? It is unfathomable. And whenever I speak to young people in my position as both the member for Baulkham Hills and in my ministerial role, I remind them about how good they have it in 2016 with the Baird Grant government. Because I remember vividly in Bankstown, growing up in the 80s, what that unemployment rate did to families. What it did to families is deny them home ownership. Not only were they unemployed thanks to Keating's reckless policies, but those of them that were employed, those of them that had a job, had to fight a record 17% mortgage rate. Again, can you imagine the good people of Western Sydney being forced to manage to pay that sort of mortgage rate? It was a disgraceful time for Labor. It was a disgraceful waste of money and certainly wasted opportunity at a time when this nation should have been dancing on the economic prosperity that we so richly deserved. Thankfully, Mr Acting Speaker, as Paul Keating reminds everybody, in March 2096 the Australian electorate was waiting for Mr Keating with the proverbial brick bat. He had to face the polls and was resoundingly defeated by John Howard. And when you compare the economic vandalism of Keating with that of John Howard and Peter Costello, who, within a very short period of time, speaking from a political point of view, not only allowed this nation to face record low interest rates, not only had the unemployment rate down to around 5%, half of what Keating thought was acceptable, but John Howard also paid off debt. And that's what this government is all about. That's what Gladys Berejiklian and Mike Baird are committed to doing. They are committed to repaying Labor's debt. That is exactly what happens in Australian politics in modern times.
Not doing a good job, are they?
Mr Acting Speaker, it goes without saying that coalition governments are the economic managers and Labor governments are the economic wreckers. I could spend my entire time here in this chamber reminding members on both sides what an appalling situation this government faced when it was elected in March 2011. We were number 8 in every single economic indicator. There was no business confidence.
That's right.
There were no employment opportunities for young people. There was no housing boom. What we had in New South Wales was akin to what we saw in Victoria at the beginning of at the end of the Kerner government, was depression. Not just economic depression, but depression because there was no opportunity. Thankfully, the people of New South Wales woke up in April 2011 and were treated to Mike Baird as their new Treasurer. And he has worked tirelessly, not only to improve economic growth, not only to improve economic opportunity, but to improve the livelihoods of those individuals that the Liberal National Party so passionately embrace when it comes to governing. Can I, Mr Acting Speaker, just put on the record how grateful I am to the Treasurer and the Premier for finally agreeing to put a railway through north-western Sydney. Mr Acting Speaker, I moved to the Hills District, having discharged from the Army at the end of 2002. It was an easy decision because my wife Nicole and I wanted to bring up a family in an area that was full of like-minded people. It was an easy decision because it was a suburb and a shire that reflected the values and hopes and aspirations that my wife and I, who were both first-generation university graduates, wanted to provide for our family. It was an easy decision because it provided choice between good public schools and good private schools. It was an easy decision because it was an area that offered the type of services that we find in Parramatta that are also required for young families.
You're putting down the other suburbs.
Mr Acting Speaker, what I did miss when I moved into the Hills District was public transport. Because having grown up in Bankstown, I was used to using public transport, and I foolishly believed the Carr government when they said on election and consistently and repeatedly since that they were going to put a railway to north-western Sydney. I have in my electorate, Mr Acting Speaker, something that you'd probably find quite amusing, if not depressing. And that is an article from the Hills News dated 1985 when the then planning minister, the Labor planning minister, had come to the Hills District and with grandiose designs and a great deal of promise said that the north-western Sydney was going to get their railway. That was 1985, and the planning minister was none other than Bob Carr. Not only did he fail to deliver it when he was a member of that disgraceful government known as the Rann-Unsworth government, another government that was thrown out with little ceremony, he also failed to deliver it in the 10 years that he was Premier, and for the 6 years that he'd passed on that baton to the conga line of Labor Premiers since then, we failed to see the Norwest Rail. In fact, I vividly remember as a CEO of the Civil Contractors Federation the 4th attempt at that announcement, and the Labor Party had the audacity to ask me to find some heavy machinery, some earth-moving equipment to move into the showground at Castle Hill, because they wanted to have a picture opportunity that the North West Rail was going to be built, as if a bobcat was going to start that job. That's the side of shallow, government by press release, basket-weaving, muesli-munching government that we had under that Labor administration. But now, Mr Acting Speaker, we have our railway. Not only is it ahead of schedule, it's also under budget, and we have to pay accolades to the Premier and the Minister for Transport and the former Minister for Transport, now Treasurer, for that wonderful opportunity. And the people of the Hills District have embraced it. They've embraced it like a long-lost relative. They've embraced the North West Rail like the new service and the promise and the hope that we get whenever a battle is finished. It's probably appropriate that the North West Rail has received so many accolades locally by way of visitations from communities and children. Mr Acting Speaker, not only have we blessed in the North West Rail because we're finally getting that railway that was denied us so long by those of the other side, but we're also enjoying security and safety. We're enjoying the record levels of spending in our emergency services. For too long, Labor had destroyed the emergency services budget because any growth that they had went to wages to pay off their union mates. The people of New South Wales were denied that very important capital that is needed and necessary to have a world-class, efficient emergency services fraternity. I'm so thrilled, Mr Acting Speaker, that when New South Welshmen and women look around the fire brigade today, they not only see a modern and technically advanced apparatus, they also see things like brand new safety helmets that are being worn and rolled out around fire stations in fire stations around New South Wales. They have those wonderful subwoofers that are on the bottom of fire engines, so that those young people that are walking around with headphones can feel the approach of a fire engine, not just have to rely on seeing it. Mr Acting Speaker, not only am I enjoying the record amount of spending in emergency services, not only am I enjoying the $8 billion investment by way of the North West Rail, but Mr Acting Speaker, we've got something very special coming to the Hills District. The Hills District, I'm delighted to report, Mr Acting Speaker, has got one of the highest numbers of children, school-aged children per capita, highest ratios of school-aged children per capita in the state. That is why we call it Nappy Valley. That's why we call it, why Kellyville is often called Kittyville. Mr Acting Speaker, we love our children in the Hills District, but what we also love is them making sure that they get an education. I'm blessed, Mr Acting Speaker, with the number of schools that are in my electorate, both public and private. I'm blessed with the fact that so many in the Hills District have been given the economic opportunities from coalition governments that they can make a fair and reasonable decision on whether or not their children will go to a public or private school. And I was delighted to share the stage just before the last election with the Minister for Education, the Honourable Adrian Piccoli, who took time out of his Sunday afternoon to visit the now member for Seven Hills and former candidate Mark Taylor, and we announced a brand new school at Bella Vista. This is what coalition governments are about, Mr Acting Speaker. Getting the management of our economy correct, seeing where the services are needed, and planning them fair and square right there in the community. I'm so thrilled and very much looking forward to this new Bella Vista school, because in the Hills District we, as I mentioned before, thrive on opportunity and education. As I said, Mr Acting Speaker, this is the freedom budget. This is the one that the coalition voters and coalition members can dine out on. This is the budget that is providing uber amounts of opportunity. It means more jobs. It means better services. It means stronger communities. And more importantly, Mr Acting Speaker, from my experience in the business community, it's all about confidence. Mr Acting Speaker, one very fortunate thing about the people of the Hills Shire. One very, very important and lucky a turn of events for those that have moved to the Hills Shire are our neighbours. Residents of the Hills Shire are fortunate to be right on the border of that wonderful city called Parramatta. Parramatta being this nation's second oldest settlement, Parramatta being the home of one of the great rugby league teams, Parramatta being the home of some of this nation's oldest and greatest schools, Parramatta, which is the home of such sporting greats as Richie Bernard. Parramatta is probably one of those suburbs that people can aspire to live in. It's fantastic, it's advanced, it is certainly a city that provides services above and beyond those that we expected and received from when the Labor Party was in government. Mr Acting Speaker, any question about the Coalition Government's commitment to Western Sydney? Any question of Mike Baird's commitment to Western Sydney will be put to sleep by any reckoning when one considers the investment that the people of Parramatta will be receiving. They'll be getting brand new stadiums. They'll be getting $1 billion invested in the hospital at Westmead. They'll be getting a wonderful new museum, which those opposite, in their inner city sandal-wearing way, have tried to campaign against. I think the people of Parramatta deserve that wonderful museum, and of course, the people of Parramatta are looking forward to their light rail. Parramatta is one of those wonderful parts of New South Wales where they have an embarrassment of riches when it comes to public transport. You can get a ferry from Parramatta Wharf to the city or to Manly. You can get a bus to anywhere around the Parramatta local government area. You can get a train, a heavy rail from Parramatta to the city and and often regularly under a half an hour. And of course in Parramatta it has wonderful opportunities for those who like walking and cycling. Mr Acting Speaker, if I can just conclude by saying a very hearty thank you to the Treasurer and Premier Baird for that wonderful policy known as the Community Building Partnerships. It's a policy that gives us the opportunity to identify within our own electorates exactly what is needed and where support from government should be directed. In my own electorate, I'm thrilled that we're able to give some funding to the Girl Guides at Baulkham Hills, who have very graciously offered me their patronage, of which I've humbly accepted. But Mr Acting Speaker, we've also seen funding towards schools to have shades, working along with local government to make sure that these services that are offered to the people of Baulkham Hills are well received. Mr Acting Speaker, I'm delighted at this budget. I'm delighted at the fact that we have a Premier and a Treasurer with real corporate experience, unlike those opposite who seem to only recruit and promote those based on their union links. I'm delighted that we have a budget that has made New South Wales #1. I'm delighted to see that with all of those economic indicators over the last 5 years, we've seen New South Wales go from #8 to #1. I'm delighted that I'm a member of this particular administration because it displays and it represents everything that is great about liberalism. Thank you.